Right. So, for any of you lucky enough to not really know who I am, the reason I'm here today is because I'm a career academic and science communicator, and I got diagnosed with ADHD in February 2021 and quickly realized I didn't want to be an academic anymore because it was a fucking nightmare. And just moved into working with ADHD, so started a podcast, a charity, etc. And now go around doing talks, and it's nice to be able to come here during ADHD Awareness Month. Theoretically, a month where we can share information with those of us that aren't ADHD, as well as those of us that are, and hopefully convince them that it's real, and yes, it affects us, and no, it's not necessarily a superpower for all of us, etc. So this talk's going to be a mix of evidence-based information and horrifically embarrassing personal reflections to try and explain how ADHD manifests itself. It's really important to start by saying this is a safe space. If you need to fidget, if you need to get up and walk around, please feel free to just unmask and be yourselves, because we should be allowed to have that space. I once said at a talk, feel free to interrupt, and that didn't go well, I'll be honest. But we'll get started. So this is roughly what we're going to talk about, but no one's going to read it, so I'll get straight into it. So my ADHD journey didn't start in 2021. It started in 1983, when I can remember quite vividly going to the doctor. I'm not even sure what for, actually, but the doctor saying to my mum, "Don't worry, Mrs. Brown, he's hyperactive, but he'll grow out of it," which was a lie. And back in 1983, particularly in rural Shropshire, ADHD didn't exist. It wasn't a thing. You couldn't be diagnosed on the NHS as a child until the year 2000, or as an adult till the year 2008. So certainly back then, it was just he's a hyperactive boy and he'll grow out of it. And that kind of myth, that perception of ADHD still exists for a lot of people, that it's a disorder of young boys, that they grow out of it, that adults can't have it, and all the other myths. You know, women don't have it, you can't be successful if you've got ADHD, if you've got a degree, you can't have ADHD. They seem to have stuck around for our group more than almost any other group, particularly amongst neurodivergent groups. So what is ADHD? Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Well, first of all, it's a really shit name. It's possibly up there with the three shittest names of any medical condition, with alien hand syndrome and mad cow disease, because it doesn't actually convey what ADHD is. If you look at the first half, attention deficit. Now, there is an asterisk there because deficit technically in medical terminology means impairment. But out in the real world, when we see the word deficit, we think reduction, we think less. And we don't have less attention. We have exactly the same amount of attention, but we often struggle to allocate it to the tasks or activities we want to, or to switch from one task to another activity, which is called task switching. And we can have more attention. We can hyper-focus on things for hours to the point where we forget to eat or drink or go to the toilet, or that my wife's shouting at me about something, because we can become so laser guided in our focus that everything else gets filtered out. And the second part of the name, hyperactivity, well, first of all, I am very overtly hyperactive. It's killing me to try and stand still because there's a camera on me. And the last time we filmed it, I kept walking out of the frame and then walking back into the frame. But for many adults with ADHD, the hyperactivity is internalized. It's feeling like you can't engage in restful activities, like you're driven by a motor. It's racing or intrusive thoughts that are always running through your head, lots of noise. And also, about 30% of adults with ADHD are purely inattentive type, so don't have hyperactivity. So it's a really unhelpful name, and nowhere in the name do you see the word emotions. And actually, emotions are a big part of ADHD in terms of how we regulate them, how we respond to criticism, etc. And they're not only not in the name, they're not in the diagnostic criteria. So it's a terrible name. It's not the worst name it's ever had. I'm wearing this T-shirt saying defect of moral control because in 1902, that's what it was called. Sir George Still wrote a paper called An Abnormal Defect of Moral Control in Children. And that's possibly where the stigma started. But it's had lots of names since 1775 when it was first described. And if you take it with a little bit of a pinch of salt, even the ancient doctors, Hippocrates and Galen, mentioned symptoms that look like ADHD in some of their patients. And it's been with us throughout the entirety of human existence. And we even know that other hominids, like Neanderthals, they had more ADHD mutations than humans did. So it exists and has existed for a very long time. And it's all about the brain. So it takes about 20 to 25 years for the human brain to develop. We've invested, in evolutionary terms, a lot of effort into developing a brain that can do things that other animals' brains can't. So so-called lower organisms like lizards, they don't have to get up and plan their day. They just get up, wait until it's warm, eat, try and mate sometimes, go to the toilet. It's simple to plan. Our lives are a bit more complicated. And even when we were hunter-gatherers, they were more complicated. So we evolved outer parts of the brain to allow us to have higher level thinking skills like planning and organization and prioritization. We call these executive functions. And actually, for most of us with ADHD, we struggle a bit with executive functions, because what happens as the brain develops is it just diverts slightly from what would be called typical in terms of brain development. There's no such thing as a neurotypical brain. There's no one brain we all compare our brains to. But the range of what would be considered typical is what we sit outside of, because little changes, tiny little changes in how the brain develops, particularly in the first few years of life. And the way in which the brain works largely is through neurons or nerves talking to each other. And that allows the front part of the brain, the frontal lobe, to talk to the temporal lobe at the side and the parietal lobe near the top, where lots of other brain structures are, to form networks. And those brain networks govern everything that we do or feel, from memory to emotion to sensation to decision making. And those networks are important because what we know in ADHD is, whilst we have the same size brain, and if you look at most forms of brain scan, you couldn't tell the difference, we know that these areas aren't as well connected. And the way in which these areas communicate is using these little chemicals called neurotransmitters. You've probably heard of dopamine, I imagine. It's kind of shorthand for ADHD, but there's 100 different neurotransmitters, and at least 7 or 8 of them are implicated in ADHD. And the medication we use for ADHD just increases the levels of some of these neurotransmitters, which get passed between neurons, activating the next neuron in the chain, or switching it off in terms of inhibitory neurotransmitters. One of the fundamental things, my meds have made my mouth so dry, apologies. One of the really important things about ADHD to accept, particularly this month, ADHD Awareness Month, is that we may be a neurodivergent group, but we are diverse even as a neurodivergent group. We're not all the same. So that means that the typical kind of one-size-fits-all concept of ADHD doesn't really apply. We all have slightly different symptoms, slightly different traits, slightly different impairments, slightly different strengths. And therefore, we are diverse. And that's important in a month like ADHD Awareness Month, because you'll see lots of stuff on social media saying ADHD is. And often you'll look at those posts and think, well, I don't do that. If you see one of these posts that says, if you do these 5 things, you might have ADHD. If one of those things is fidget or be hyperactive, and you're purely inattentive, then you might think, well, I don't fidget, I'm not hyperactive, I haven't got ADHD. Or if you've got a diagnosis, you might question whether you tricked the psychiatrist, which we often think we do. You know, we'll have imposter syndrome, so we think we can't do our own job, but at the same time think we're clever enough to trick a medical professional with 15 years of practice in diagnosing ADHD in adults. So it's really important to accept we're all slightly different. And that's a wonderful thing. I think if we were all the same, I wouldn't want to have ADHD, because I love the fact that we're all slightly different. We all think and act slightly differently. So ADHD is a lifelong neurodevelopmental disorder. If you don't like the word disorder, that's fine. That's just the medical terminology. And if we break that down, what that means is lifelong. Well, that's obvious. It doesn't go away. Now, if you look at the statistics from children to adults, about half of children diagnosed with ADHD as an adult are no longer classed as having ADHD. A lot of the time, that's because they disengage with the NHS, and then when they go back to the GP saying, I'd like help with my ADHD now, nowadays, you're told you need to be re-diagnosed, get to the back of the queue. And partly it's because we can build coping strategies, we can learn how to deal with elements of our ADHD to the point where it's no longer necessarily too much of a problem. But in terms of the changes in the brain that lead to ADHD, they last throughout the lifespan. And it affects a lot of us, probably about 3% of all adults. So in the UK, that's around 1.5 million adults with ADHD. About 90% of those are undiagnosed, either because they're on an interminably long waiting list to try and get assessed by the NHS, or they don't know what ADHD is. We often find out about ADHD because a friend or a family member gets diagnosed, particularly with family members, because when you fill in an informant report for a child or a sibling and you look at the symptoms and go, oh, that rings a bell. And it's often at that point that we realize we can also smell our own. So if you see a sibling or a partner that's got it and you just know, and you can then look around your family and spot the people that have probably got ADHD, because it is a largely genetic disorder. About 80% of the risk of developing ADHD is inherited from our parents because of genetic mutations. There are other genetic changes which can add to that 80%, but ADHD isn't solely genetic. There normally has to be an environmental trigger, often just before or just after birth, which with the genetic changes means the brain develops slightly differently. And then years later, as we're children, we start to see those symptoms present. So it's genetic. First degree relatives are between 5 and 7 times more likely to have ADHD than a member of the general public. So we can see it passed down through families. We can see it in our siblings, in our parents, in our children, largely because of that genetic element. I had my DNA assessed, God, it was years ago. And when I didn't know I had ADHD and then went back and looked at my DNA, and I think I've got something like 49 ADHD-related mutations. And that sounds like a lot, but actually on their own, those mutations wouldn't do anything. You need to have a number of them, which collectively then create enough change for the brain to develop differently. And it's not new, ADHD, as I said. This is a list of publications, scientific books, scientific papers, which were published describing ADHD. And the first one was in 1775. It was actually called attention deficit. I'm not going to do the German because that would just be a car crash. But even after that, Alexander Crichton, The Disease of Attention in 1798, Benjamin Russ, a syndrome involving inability to focus attention, 1812, The Nervous Child by Charles West. Throughout the last 250 years, multiple physicians have written books or papers saying there's this thing I've seen in my patients where they struggle to pay attention, they struggle to sit still, or if you're Sir George Still, they've got an abnormal defect of moral control. And if you look at the symptoms that the first author gave, they're pretty accurate. Although he did also say that we are, careless and bacchanalian, which I think is a wonderful description of ADHD. These are some of the causes, so don't worry too much about the names of the genes. These are some of the genes that are most commonly mutated in ADHD. But what they do is regulate those neurotransmitters, those chemicals that allow one neuron to speak to another. So the first 3 here are to do with dopamine, 2 dopamine receptors and a transporter, and the last 3 there are to do with other neurotransmitters. And these are the most common mutations. The lifestyle factors, the environmental stuff, I don't like talking about this, largely because it's one of the reasons there's stigma on mothers with ADHD. Because if you look at stuff that's written on here, it's largely exposure to things in utero. Now, that doesn't mean that just exposure to things in utero causes ADHD. It means largely that male scientists have just looked in mothers to see what the facts are rather than looking in fathers. Because we know, for example, that the diet that a male parent has can influence the quality of sperm, which can influence what happens at conception and afterwards. But no one's really looked at that yet. Importantly, at the bottom, if you can see, sugar doesn't cause ADHD, but that myth still persists. Food colorings don't cause ADHD. There's a couple of really small studies suggesting a small effect, but they're so small it's not really worth taking them into account. But things like air pollution, chemicals found in plastics, hypothyroidism in a mother, these are things which are known to contribute towards the risk of developing ADHD. Right, symptoms and diagnosis. The way in which ADHD is diagnosed is based on either two models. So the American Psychiatric Association have a book called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or DSM, and the World Health Organization have a separate set of criteria in their what's called ICD-11. Now, our NHS guidelines suggest we should use the World Health Organization system, but we don't. Most psychiatrists use the DSM version. Now, there's an important difference between the two, because in order to get a diagnosis with these symptoms, you need to be positive for 5 out of the 9, and those symptoms need to be severe, so that's often or very often. And the symptoms need to have a moderate impact, that's a grey area word straight away, on at least 2 domains of life. So it could be work, it could be relationships, finance, etc. Whereas the World Health Organization classification just says several symptoms. And what we know is lots of people actually just fall short of the threshold, and that's called subthreshold ADHD, and therefore get no support whatsoever. So if we had a different system actually that didn't require this semi-arbitrary number of 5, it's 6 in children, by the way, then more people would be able to access support after waiting for 7 years. Now, if you look at these lists of symptoms, you can reflect on them. Do you recognize these symptoms in yourself? Do you recognize them in people that you work with or support? This is quite a simple list compared to the next list, because most of the symptoms are based around paying attention to things. Now, I've highlighted the first one, making careless mistakes and lacking attention to detail, normally because there's lots of mistakes in my presentation. But I thought that this would be a story you might enjoy. So this is Liverpool South Parkway railway station toilet. I went there with Mrs. ADHD, my wife and emotional support animal, a couple of years ago. And we were visiting friends, and on the way back, we thought, we'll get a coffee, we'll sit in Costa. And then realised, shit, the train's about to leave, rushed to the train, and my wife had left her bag in Costa, her case. So we thought, we'll get the next one. Now, at that point, I suddenly needed to evacuate my bowels with great urgency. So I looked around for the toilet, and it's quite an old toilet, Liverpool South Parkway railway toilet, because it's like the toilets on a train. It's got a Star Trek-like door that opens like that. It's got buttons, it's confusing, and I was about to shit myself. So there were 3 lovely ladies in a queue, and it's the first time as an adult I've ever had to say, I'm so sorry, do you mind if I go first because I'm going to shit myself? And they said, yes, of course, go, which is wonderful. And I went in and I rushed and I sat down. And then as I was explosively evacuating my bowels, the door just slid open and then closed and then open again and then closed as I was screaming, don't look at me, as about 100 people could see me evacuating my bowels on a toilet. Now, if you look closely, right next to me is a little red button to lock the door. But I didn't notice it. I didn't pay attention to my surroundings, so everybody got to see me having a poo. This is the other side of ADHD, diagnostically speaking, hyperactivity and impulsiveness. Now, the latest opinion on ADHD is that we should possibly separate these two things, and there will be 3 diagnostic columns. The reason they're grouped together is they both stem from a lack of what we call cognitive inhibition. That's the ability to stop ourselves from saying things, thinking things, doing things, or moving. It's complicated, though, because mixing these 2 things in, remember, you have to have 5 symptoms, particularly if you've learned coping strategies, and particularly if you have built such powerful masks that you don't recognize some of these symptoms, it can make it complicated. I was positive for 14 out of the whole 18 symptoms, but only because I couldn't be asked to finish filling the form. And it's a very long form, so for the last 2, I put not applicable, because I thought I've probably got enough, to be fair. Now, when I look at them, it definitely should have been 16 out of 18, but the form was just such hard work. Again, 5 out of the 9 needed in order to get a diagnosis with the same kind of other criteria. And if you're positive for both, like I am, you're combined type ADHD presentation. Again, how can this manifest itself on a daily basis? I normally show something on hyperactivity, but I thought I'd talk about impulsiveness. You probably all saw me go for a cigarette. I'm a smoker. I'm not proud of that. And my wife, who has the senses of a wolf, partly because of her sensory processing issues, can smell my cigarette smoke from a year away, let alone a mile away. So we were going down to do a talk, and I thought, I need a cigarette. And then I thought, she's going to smell. I'll buy some mouthwash from inside a shopping centre. And immediately got out of the shop, opened it, poured it in my mouth, and then thought, when am I going to spit it out? So walked around this shopping centre with a mouthful of stinging mouthwash before spitting it back in the bottle and putting the top on. Because impulsiveness by nature is engaging in an activity without considering the consequences adequately. And I just thought, mouthwash, great, not what am I going to do with it after I've rinsed my mouth? These are the three presentations then of ADHD, and these are statistics that are roughly accurate in adults. You'll see different statistics here and there. But it's also evidence of why I was right to leave science, because the middle bit of this Venn diagram is meant to be about 70%, and instead it's about 15%. So the most common presentation is combined type ADHD. So that's issues with attention and issues with hyperactivity and impulsivity. About 20 to 30% of adults are purely inattentive type ADHD. That doesn't mean you can't be hyperactive. It doesn't mean you can't be impulsive. It just means you didn't meet sufficient symptoms to be classed as combined type. And then you've got this tiny or massive, depending on the Venn diagram, group of people who are purely hyperactive, impulsive type ADHD. And this isn't a scientific fact. It's more of a slightly informed opinion. There are some people that think this isn't ADHD, that this is a separate neurodivergence. And what that tells us is that actually we're using artificial terms to describe what is a three-dimensional cluster of symptoms. People with ADHD are far more likely to have other neurodivergences. So to be diagnosably autistic or have autistic traits, to have dyslexia, or developmental coordination disorder or dyspraxia, or to have some of the traits of those things. And therefore, we're complex. We often don't just have ADHD, and this system of kind of having one umbrella term with 2/3 different potential causes for that will change in the future, hopefully. At the center of all of this, though, really, is that ADHD is an executive function disorder. So remember, the outer parts of the brain, particularly at the front, the prefrontal cortex, are really the rational brain. This is where a lot of those skills, planning, organization, for example, that's where they are coordinated. And this is one of the areas of the brain where we see the most difference in ADHD. And that means that often we can struggle with some executive functions. Depending on which psychologist you read, there are a number of these executive functions, and they can be separated into hot executive functions, those that involve emotion, and cold ones, those that just involve cognition. And these are just three of them. I use emojis to add some peril, because I've got to remember what they are. The first one's working memory. Now, working memory is a function of the brain that stores information for the shortest amount of time while the brain works out, is this even worth processing into short-term memory before long-term memory? So when somebody says, oh, I'll give you my number, and you're grabbing your phone and you're unlocking it and you're finding contacts and they're reading the number out, and then immediately when you get to put it in, you'll go, sorry, what was the number again? That's a lack of working memory. And working memory has two forms: visuospatial, so that's your surroundings, and also things that you hear and things that you see. So the amount of times a day I put my phone down and I know where I put it, but within 10 seconds, I'll think, where'd I put my phone? And we'll look in the furthest part of the house, nowhere near where I've been, because I legitimately cannot remember that 10 seconds ago I put my phone on a work surface there. That's working memory. When you meet someone, we'll do a quick straw poll. When you meet someone and they tell you their name, who can remember straight away what their name is? Well, I can't. I have to repeat their name internally. Tim, and then still forget. And if you combine working memory with distractibility, and we'll talk about time blindness later, you get this triangle of fun where you can be working on a task, get distracted, forget how much time has passed, and all of a sudden it's 2 hours since you were working on that task and you've now got to try and re-engage with it. Organisation and planning are also executive functions, and they're ones that I'm particularly bad at. So I do lots of talks around the country, and if I'm left to organise the transport, it goes wrong. So I booked trains in the wrong direction for the wrong number of people in the wrong month. I booked one hotel that was 137 miles away from the venue I was speaking at, and I booked a stay in a homeless shelter as well, because my organisation and planning skills are terrible. Now, we're not all the same. Some of us have incredible organisation and planning skills. It happens to be a weakness of mine. And then this last part is important. It's called delay discounting, but don't worry so much about the name. You can call it delay gratification. This isn't just an ADHD thing. It's found not just in humans, but throughout the animal kingdom. And that's the observation that the longer the amount of time between a decision and the reward you get from that decision, the less likely you are to stick to that decision. So our brains with ADHD will often direct us to immediate but small rewards. So that can be going on your phone, looking on YouTube, listening to some music, having something to eat, rather than delayed but much bigger rewards, like doing the work you're paid to that pays for your salary, that pays for your mortgage or your rent. And this is something that often is misconstrued by people with ADHD as, we're less able, we're less capable, and we're more interested in doing other things. It's not about choice. We don't choose often the things that we get dragged off to do. It's something that our brain directs us to. And a good example of this would probably be when we painted it. In lockdown, we decided we'd paint the house because we'd owned it for about 5 years. It already looked like a shithole. And we thought, well, let's buy some paint. Now, going to the shop and buying something, that's rewarding for 2 impulse purchases. Looking at the different colours on the swatches, that's rewarding because there's lots of choice there. We bought white, by the way. But painting the house, which is a delayed reward, having a nicely painted house where the surfaces look clean and we can be proud of it, that's weeks, actually years, if I'm honest, away, because we bought 8 tins of paint and we've still got 7.5 tins of paint in the garage because we started, and then, as you may recognise this, started and then decided to do something else. And then all of a sudden it's not rewarding to paint the house, so we'll move to something else. So that delayed gratification is a big part of ADHD, which we'll talk about a bit later on. The diagnostic stuff is interesting. It's a flawed diagnostic test. It's really important to point that out, that it discriminates against women and people of colour, because when they were developing the test, it was largely boys and largely white boys that were used to develop that test. So it's a test that picks up the symptoms that boys commonly have, not necessarily the symptoms that girls and women or people of colour commonly have. We tend to present slightly differently in childhood and adulthood. So boys are often, but not always, more hyperactive and behaviourally challenging. Girls are often, but not always, a bit more internalised, daydreamy, anxious. And the test doesn't look for those symptoms as much. And those symptoms don't get picked up as much, which is one of the reasons that in childhood, there's around 5 boys to every 1 girl that gets diagnosed, even though there's no real significant difference between the biological sexes. But this stuff is far more interesting. And it's often when you learn about the non-diagnostic symptoms, when you're on that journey of working out, do I have ADHD, that you think, oh, okay, maybe I do. Because this is the stuff that often has a big day-to-day impact. I mentioned emotions at the start. About 70% of adults with ADHD have what's called emotional dysregulation. And that means that our emotional responses to life's events can be unpredictable. They can be inappropriate. That's a societal term. So societally inappropriate. They can have a very long duration. They can be particularly strong and not related, if you like, to the event. So very small things can lead to a massive response. Like recently, Sam and I went to a shopping centre and we thought, let's get some food from the food court. It's actually my idea. There was nothing there for me. So I didn't speak to my wife for 8 hours, went home, sulked, cried, because I couldn't get anything from the food court. Now, the guilt and shame that I had for doing that, acting like a little baby because I couldn't have the food I wanted, and then going home and not speaking to my wife because she got the food she wanted, can really be challenging in different relationships, whether it's at work, whether it's with family members, with friends, or with an intimate partner. A subset of emotional dysregulation, and this is the biggie for most of us, is rejection sensitivity. There's not actually a lot of research into this. It was first looked into in the 1970s, anecdotally around kind of almost 100%, about 99% of adults with ADHD report that they've got rejection sensitivity. And rejection sensitive dysphoria, which is the full name, is an extreme reaction to being rejected or criticized or ignored, or thinking you've been rejected, criticized or ignored, or thinking you're going to be rejected, criticized or ignored. It causes massive distress. And it can lead people to completely avoid situations where you might get rejected or criticized. It can lead many of us to become people pleasers and say yes to everything, because if you say yes, you're delaying any criticism until later on. You're saying something positive. I'm lucky and I don't have that much rejection sensitivity, but I did when I was younger. So events like, for example, having sex with my girlfriend and realizing she was watching the television, that's the type of thing that can lead to a lifelong aversion to getting involved in romantic relationships and a lot of self-esteem issues. Equally, being intimate with my current partner and during the act, her noticing and verbally saying, "Have you seen the cobwebs up there?" can be an issue in relationships. Now, that latter situation, which happened, is related to mind wandering. We'll talk about that in a bit. But RSD is such a problem in the workplace, particularly. If you put in a piece of work and get even constructive criticism back, it can be devastating. I used to be a barman when I was doing my PhD, and I worked at a Yates's Wine Lodge. Do they still exist? I'm not sure. And because I was the tallest person there, my job at the end of a Saturday night was to wheel in these massive tables and set them up for Sunday lunch. And I did that 3 Saturdays on the trot, then had a Saturday night off, came in on Sunday for the Sunday lunch. And in the morning team meeting, the landlord said, "I'd just like to thank Steve for bringing the tables in last night. He did a really good job." So I quit, because he'd never thanked me. And he was quite shocked, and he said, "Well, why are you quitting?" And I said, "Got a virus." And he said, "Which one?" And I said, "They don't know." Because I was so desperate to get out of there, I would say anything to just leave that room and never speak to them again, because I'd never been thanked for bringing the tables in, but somebody called Steve had. It felt like an implicit rejection, and I didn't handle it well. Other non-diagnostic symptoms. So these aren't things that are really explored in the diagnostic process. Emotional regulation is mentioned in one of the diagnostic systems, but it's not a tick box you have to prove that you have. Other issues, time blindness. The parts of the brain that regulate our perception of time, including the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, again, develop slightly differently, function slightly differently. And that means the perception of the passing of time can be different. Estimating how long it takes to do something can be different, or repeating a time interval of something we've done before in the same amount of time can be challenging. And again, in most kind of domains of our life, this can cause issues. Somebody I coach actually brought their wife into the end of a coaching session because she just wanted to have a go at her partner and tell me that he's making excuses, because the night before she'd gone out and said, "I'm going to be back in 90 minutes. Can you put the tea on?" And her partner said, "Yeah, of course." And of course, 90 minutes went like that. She came back in, "Where's the tea?" He was like, "Well, I thought you said 90 minutes," because he hadn't really processed that passing of time, and then that caused conflict. Many of us as well, and this isn't just an ADHD thing, it's a neurodivergent thing, have issues with different sensations. So sensory processing issues. The most common in ADHD is light. So about 70% of adults with ADHD are sensitive to light, sometimes photophobic. But also, if you think of any senses, and we don't just have 5, we've got up to 33 different senses. They're all processed in the brain. So sometimes it's touch, labels in the back of a piece of clothing. Sometimes it's the texture of food. Sometimes it's temperature. But all of these things can cause kind of distress in the brain. If you can just hear one particular noise, which is called misophonia, which is standing out and irritating above all others, it makes it hard to function in an environment. My wife has to wear noise-cancelling headphones when I eat or breathe, apparently. Which again can cause issues with rejection sensitivity when we're sat having tea and she's, I'll just put my headphones in. And, I now accept that this is for her because it stops her being in distress, but sensory processing issues are very common. And then lastly, and I think this is really important because a recent NHS trust said that they are only referring complex ADHD cases. Now, technically, 85% of us are complex because around 80 to 85% of us have a coexisting condition. Now, often that's a mental health condition. We're about 3 times as likely to have a mood disorder as a member of the general public, about 3 to 4 times as likely to have an anxiety disorder as a member of the general public, more likely to have eating disorders, issues with substance use or gambling, and also some weird physical comorbidities as well. So migraines, chronic migraines, we're more likely to have hyperflexible joints or Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, muscle pain, fibromyalgia, hypothyroidism, and other hormone imbalances are more common in ADHD. So for most of us, the vast majority, we don't just have ADHD, there are other things that come along with it, which again complicate day-to-day living with ADHD. Now, the emotional side of things are quite interesting. And part of the reason that we struggle with controlling our emotions is down to how we've evolved. So we've evolved. This is a nature or nurture question. We've evolved so that when we see a stick that looks a bit like a snake, we think snake, not stick, because there's an evolutionary benefit to that, because if it is a snake, you'll move away from it. Now, the way in which nowadays our environment has changed means that we often don't see snakes, but in evolutionary terms, we still have that same system in place. So if we feel a threat, and nowadays often for people with ADHD, that threat is uncertainty or change or a situation that's caused an emotional response. In the brains of people without ADHD, what would happen is the rational part of the brain would communicate with the emotional part and say, it's okay, it's not a threat, you're fine. But because that rational part is less well connected to the emotional parts of the brain, the amygdala and the hippocampus, completely dominate. And that's why we can end up having these really intense emotional responses that can last much longer than they do in people without ADHD. So we've evolved to notice threats, but the way in which our brains work is that we often can't dampen down that feeling of threat, even when we realize that we're actually safe. There's nothing necessarily bad that's going to happen. It's just a situation which we weren't prepared for, or there's some uncertainty. Obviously, you don't have to disclose this, but I imagine if there are some people here who were diagnosed, you may have had some trouble getting medication at some point in the last year. That shortage is still continuing. It's largely for methylphenidate now. Lisdexamfetamine or Alvance supplies are largely okay. And medication is the main mode of treatment. So for about 80% of adults with ADHD, medication is effective. But effective is a wide range of effectiveness. For some people, it feels like this is how other people think. This is amazing. I can focus on things. I can, do those tasks that are unrewarding. And for many of us, it just makes us a bit more functional. And we actually know that outside of the ADHD population, the medications are either abused by people who want to focus more, students taking ADHD meds. But we also know if you give ADHD medication to women with menopause who don't have ADHD, it improves brain fog and memory and emotional regulation. And the medication does this by increasing levels of those neurotransmitters, not just dopamine, but noradrenaline and serotonin. And by doing that, it makes up for the issues the brain has in using those neurotransmitters, because we don't have less of them. We don't have less dopamine. It just doesn't work as well as it does in the brain of somebody without ADHD. That leaves 20% of people. Now, for those 20%, either the drugs aren't effective, the side effects are too high, or there's some medical condition that might contraindicate the use of medication. And for those people, it's not a lot that's offered. The NHS guidance is to offer therapy, cognitive behavioural therapy, but the evidence for that effectiveness is very low. Even by the NHS's own evidence body, NICE, they say it's very low quality evidence. And beyond that, unless you've got an incredible GP or psychiatric team, or you're in an area where there are great services, that's pretty much all you get. Out the door, maybe with some medication. Now try and understand and explain yourself and ADHD to people. It's really inappropriate. What we need is to have medication if you want it and if it works, therapy if you need it, access to education to try and understand ADHD, coaching should be offered to people, and fundamentally as well, sleep training. Because for about 2/3 to 80% of us, we have issues with sleep, whether it's insomnia, delayed sleep onset, poor sleep quality. And we know that a lack of sleep makes pretty much every ADHD symptom worse. Trying to focus, for a 2-hour meeting the morning after not sleeping, well, I just wouldn't even turn up because it's not going to happen. And for many of us, it's challenging because our brains are more active at night. And those racing thoughts, a little bit like an earworm, it's so common that we'll get into bed feeling really tired, turn the light off and instantly start thinking about something. And then, no, get out of my head. And then it comes back. And those intrusive thoughts and racing thoughts can keep us awake for long periods during the night. But again, it's something that we don't have a lot of support for. Even medications like melatonin, which is the sleep hormone, which most people with ADHD release about 90 minutes later than people without ADHD. It's not massively effective for most of us. Partly for the lack of medical support is we've got quite a high bar for evidence in the UK, whereas in America, they'll throw drugs at anybody because it's an insurance-based system. But that also means they've got some really interesting and useful medications for sleep, some that don't make you fall asleep, but will help you stay asleep once you've fallen asleep, for example, would be really useful to have access to, but currently we don't. I put this slide in because it's quite useful for people who either can't get meds or waiting for an assessment. What else can you do that can help with symptoms? The best evidence we've got is for exercise. And a lot of these things are the things that we all don't do, either because the executive function needed to do it, or let's face it, not many people like exercising, or that, for example, like mindfulness, we just think, yeah, good one, mindfulness. But we know that exercise is probably the most powerful, non-commonly used intervention. It increases focus even during a bout of exercise, and it increases focus and attention after exercise. So regular exercise can help us focus our attention, and it can also help us regulate our emotions a little bit. It doesn't have to be going to the gym. 30 minutes brisk walking in the morning can actually help set you up for the day. And we know that education, we call it psychoeducation, the delivery of structured information about the condition, improves outcomes for people with ADHD. Our charity is about to set up with the NHS, the UK's first national psychoeducation course. So when you get a diagnosis, you should be directed towards a course on NHS Digital to help people understand ADHD. Because again, at the minute, apart from some very small courses or things you have to pay for, there's not a lot of education out there. Improving your sleep routine. You've mentioned sleep. Now, this is challenging because fundamentally most people lie when it comes to sleep hygiene. When you say to people, so do you not look at any screens for the last couple of hours before sleep? People say, yeah, turn them off. And most of us do. Do you try and go to bed at the same time every night? Yep. And most of us, it's kind of when our brain lets us, particularly if we've got kind of revenge sleep procrastination. The bedroom should be about 2 degrees colder than the other rooms in the house, should be completely dark, should only be used for 2 things, sleep and cobwebs. And we know an improved sleep routine can help. Mindfulness. This is the one where people, I can see some shaking heads already. And I get that because I tried Headspace once and lasted 15 seconds before I was shouting, of course I can feel the fucking chair against my legs. I'm sat on it, aren't I? But mindfulness doesn't have to be apps like Headspace or Calm. Any activity that you are mindful while you're doing it, we know can help with ADHD symptoms. it helps turn off parts of the brain I'm going to talk about in a bit called the default mode network, or the daydreaming part of the brain. So cooking can be mindful, exercise or dancing can be mindful, even having a bath can be mindful. And I go so far as to say, and please don't do this, smoking is my mindfulness, because actually while I'm sat outside smoking, I am, for the only time during a day, aware of my surroundings, what I can hear, what I can feel, more connected with my body. Now, the reason that mindfulness and also assisted relaxation, so breathing exercises, for example, work is because they dampen down the fight or flight response largely, because many of us are almost in a constant state of fight or flight. If you look at the symptoms of anxiety and stress and the symptoms of ADHD, they kind of intermingle a lot. So trying to control our stress and anxiety levels can be really beneficial in terms of regulating. And the last thing is caffeine. If you're a responder, then we know caffeine can cause dopamine release. So have a couple of cups of coffee. And we're talking about little percentages here and there in terms of the impact that it has. But we know that these things can help. There's a lot of stuff out there that we don't know if it can help. So you're I met the guys, anyone heard of Get Doper? It's a supplement which you can buy. It's kind of heavily promoted on Instagram. I went to a Seed Talks at a Women in ADHD summit on Saturday, and I met the founder, and he came over, and there's no evidence that their product works whatsoever. And it's 30 quid a month for powder you put into a shake and drink. And most of that you'll just pass out in your urine. And there's a lot of other products like Lion's Mane, brain training apps, no evidence that they work. That doesn't mean they don't work. It just means we have no evidence that they work. But for desperate people who are looking for support while they're waiting for an assessment or waiting for titration, it's understandable that if you see a post for a supplement that says this will help you focus, you'd be willing to try it, because most of us will try anything to try and keep those symptoms at bay. Why do we have those symptoms though? Again, remember that the brain's slightly different. Ignore the stuff at the top there because it's unimportant. I mean, it is important, but it's boring. We have different brains between all of us. So the changes that might be seen in my brain will be different to Pat's brain, will be different to your brains. And that's one of the reasons we don't have an objective test yet for adults that's accurate enough. You may have seen in the news that for children, they've now approved what's called the QB test, which is an objective test as part of the diagnostic process, but it's not as accurate in adults. And therefore, you can't scan the brain of somebody with ADHD and say, yep, that's an ADHD brain, because we're all slightly different. So our biological diversity is why we have this behavioral diversity. Some people are more forgetful than others. Some people are more hyperactive or impulsive than others. But all of those symptoms come from the way in which the brain works. And this horrific slide shows you some of the areas of the brain where we have pretty robust and repeated evidence of differences. So don't worry too much about the names, because anatomy is awful. The anterior cingulate cortex just means the front of the outside of a girdle. So the posterior means the back of the outside of a girdle. But if you look at the things that these brain structures and networks do, executive functions in the prefrontal cortex, so organizing, planning, prioritizing, paying attention to things outside the body, reward and motivation, which we'll come on to, reward again, emotions, perception of time and emotions, attention to internal processes like our thoughts. It's easy to see why these brain areas are related to ADHD, because the processes and behaviors they regulate are directly related to the symptoms that we have. And the brain works in networks, remember, and we know that there are at least 3 networks which are probably heavily involved in ADHD. The first one has an awful name, the corticostriatal thalamic cortical loop. So that's a loop from the front of the brain that goes into the deep areas of the brain and then comes back to the front. And these connected brain areas then regulate movement. So that's the hyperactive part of ADHD, the formation of habits, and again, reward, which you will come back to. Speaking of reward, we have a reward center in the brain called the mesolimbic or mesocorticolimbic pathway. So this is a system of structures that help us feel the sensation of reward either before an event or during an event. And that reward is, again, fundamental to ADHD because it's what our brain seeks. You'll often hear the phrase kind of dopamine seeking or dopamine addiction or dopamine chasing. They're all bullshit terms. But what we do is we look for reward, and dopamine happens to be the main reward neurotransmitter. And then we've got this default mode network. I mentioned it earlier because it's the part of the brain that mindfulness can help dampen down. Now, when we're not engaged in a task, sat on the sofa, if you can sit down on the sofa, you're not hyperactive, and just thinking about things that have happened during the day, reflecting on conversations or daydreaming, or something called mind wandering, which is where you can just flip from thought to thought without necessarily planning to think about those things. These are useful activities because you can reflect on things. You can think about things that have happened in the past or the future. But when you start engaging in a task, that part of the brain gets switched off. So if you're a truck driver, when you're driving that truck, the daydreaming part of the brain gets switched off, unless you've got ADHD, where it stays switched on. And that's the reason that we have mind wandering. So you can be engaged in a really important conversation with your partner, and all of a sudden your brain's suddenly somewhere else and you're flitting from thought to thought, and then you're back in the room. The trouble I've got into with the word yes because of mind wandering is ridiculous, because the amount of times halfway through a conversation, my brain's gone somewhere else and I've come back and someone said, "What do you think?" And as a people pleaser, my default answer is yeah. So I've agreed to a threesome, to buy a kilo of cocaine, to sell my car, and lots of other things because I wasn't listening to the conversation because my brain had just taken me somewhere else. And then my default answer is always yes. If you want something out of me, just talk to me for longer than 5 minutes because I'll come back when my brain's been somewhere else and we'll just say yes. We're going to take a bit of a break because by now you probably want to stretch your legs and relieve the boredom. But mind wandering, again, is a central part of ADHD. Now, remember that the actual test for ADHD isn't very good at picking up ADHD in women and girls. We actually know that there's some evidence that if you measure mind wandering, and there is a test called the Mind Excessively Wandering Scale, or MUSE, that test has been shown in a couple of studies to be better at picking up ADHD in women than the test for ADHD. Because mind wandering is a central part of the way in which our brains work. You probably heard this anecdote before, and again, I'm always talking about sex and poo in these talks. But mind wandering, again, can have a big impact in different areas of life. If you're at work and you're in a meeting, you're trying to listen to what's being said, and all of a sudden you hear, "James, what do you think?" Which has happened when I was an academic during a 3-hour meeting where we were agreeing what degrees people got. And it was 3 hours, so come on, give me a break. But I can remember all of a sudden the chair saying, "Right, we're going to have to vote on this one because it's complicated." And I just thought, shit, I wasn't paying attention to that. And thought, it's okay, I'll look at who puts their hands up and put mine up. And the chair said, "And we're not doing hands. You've all got to message me privately and tell me whether it's a first or an upper second." So I just messaged saying, "Sorry, I wasn't listening." And it was 12-12 vote. So mine was a casting vote, but my mind had wandered somewhere else. Equally, again, in the romantic setting, I've said, again, I know a few of you will have heard this, it's really difficult to maintain an erection when you're thinking about crisps and prawn cocktail. And if your partner has rejection sensitivity, try explaining that one. "I'm so sorry, it's not you, it's crisps." But that's the impact that mind wandering can have, because it's not that we consciously think, "I'm not interested in this activity." I'm going to think about, do weebles really wobble and not fall down? Or what was the name of all the flumps? And then all of a sudden we're back in the room and in an intimate situation, that's happened. And it's hard to explain. Right, so we're going to take a break for 5 or 10 minutes and then we'll finish off with a shorter part 2. Thank you very much. I've mentioned reward a few times because, again, it's centrally important to ADHD. Because reward drives motivation. The motivation to engage in a task often comes from a previous experience where we found that task rewarding. And motivation in ADHD works slightly differently. Generally, but not always, we lack internal motivation. So that's the motivation to do things for ourselves. But we often respond well to external motivation, whether that's a deadline, whether it's doing something for somebody else. So finding motivation to engage in unrewarding tasks can be challenging. And therefore, our brain will often direct us to what we call palatable alternatives, so your phone or listening to music, or aversive alternatives. So if you want your house cleaned, just ask somebody with ADHD to do their job, and believe me, they will clean your house better than anybody else because it's not doing their job. So reward is, if you like, it's unconscious. We don't pick and choose the things we find rewarding largely. And it's the sensation we get either before or following a behavior. So anticipatory reward is one of the reasons we impulse spend. I'm pretty sure most of us here will have bought something on Amazon, and by the time it arrives, aren't really that interested about opening it because it's the buying and kind of waiting for it to come that's rewarding. And that's something that we see in people with gambling addictions. We know that anticipatory reward is often stronger than the reward we get after an experience. So placing a bet and waiting for it to come in often gives more reward than a bet coming in, or whatever form of gambling. And we have internal rewards and external rewards. And again, it's those internal rewards that we generally don't have that much control over. And the parts of the brain, you can see it here again, apologies for an anatomical picture, but this is the reward pathway. And an area of the brain called the ventral tegmental area releases dopamine to various areas to give us that sensation that this is a rewarding activity, which we learn from, and then it gives us the motivation to engage with that activity again. And what that means is that motivation comes from reward. If you don't find a task rewarding, it is more difficult to find the motivation to engage with that task, even if you want to, even if you acknowledge that it's important, even sometimes if it's important for other people. Finding that motivation from inside is difficult. This is why body doubling often helps. Having an accountability partner who can just sit there, or even be on a Zoom call or a Teams call just as a bit of accountability, often gives us the motivation to engage in a task. And we know how powerful, this is my favorite slide, by the way, we know how powerful reward is, even from basic laboratory experiments. So if you take some laboratory rats and give them cocaine, which obviously is really cruel, because A, they can't hold the credit card, and B, they haven't got a mobile phone to call them later to get more. But if you give rodents cocaine in their water, cocaine causes a huge release of dopamine, which therefore gives them motivation to go back and do that again. And we know that if, in this scenario, if you give rodents access to cocaine in their water and then offer them water or water with cocaine, they go straight for the water with cocaine. But if you enrich their environment, so they've got other things to do, wheel, other activities, they don't. They'll go to the water. So it tells you that there are other things that can give us motivation, even compared to things as powerful as substances that can cause massive releases of dopamine. And this reward pathway has been mercilessly hacked by social media platforms, mobile phone manufacturers, who all employed psychologists while they were developing their products and asked them, how do we make this addictive? How do we have a platform that just draws people back in? So one of the reasons that we do have higher mobile phone use, we do have higher social media and mobile phone addiction, even though that's not often recognized by many psychologists or psychiatrists, is because they've been designed for us. You know, you can swipe down, see if anybody's liked your post on Instagram, not normally, James, and then put your phone away, but then 5 minutes later, get it back out and swipe down again because it's giving us a reward to engage in that task. And often more reward than filling in a spreadsheet or writing a report or working on a strategy, which we know are important. But if our brains don't find them rewarding, it's just more difficult to engage in this type of stuff. You know, paying the speeding ticket, which is now overdue because I was driving too fast, paying the bill that's overdue. For me, and I find this really weird now, and I used to be able to do this, which is another of the wonders of ADHD, is it's a performance issue, not an ability issue. And that means that we can sometimes do stuff, but then the next day, when nothing's changed, it's much harder. And my kryptonite at the minute is emails. When I was an academic, I'd get 250 a day and I'd answer them all. If I get more than 5 in a day now, I just panic. and hide because I find it so unrewarding, even though I love communicating with people, to just open the email and have to type an answer. And I have to sit with my wife in the morning at 8 o'clock while she watches me do emails, because that's body doubling, or I won't engage with them. So reward's a huge part of ADHD, and it's not something that gets the proper evidence-based kind of notice and attention that it does. Instead, it just gets kind of societal comments about the fact that, you know, there was even an article written in the press last year, if you just put your mobile phones down, that'll get rid of your ADHD, which is obviously untrue, but it's also really diminishing to people with ADHD, because we know that screens don't cause ADHD. And we know that actually when we're engaging in rewarding tasks, it's often not about thrill seeking or dopamine seeking. It's about trying to quieten everything down. Because when we have a release of dopamine, a lot of the intrusive thoughts, the racing thoughts, my wife calls them channels. Now, my wife's autistic as well as ADHD. She's ADHD. So she, it fascinates me. So she's got about 40 channels running at the same time. And therefore, some of them sometimes pop out. So she'll say stuff which I've got no idea what the context is, because it's just something that was in one of her channels. And all of that kind of noise that we have just becomes a bit quieter when we have dopamine. Now, you all obviously now know that I overshare. I, for many years, was a heavy cocaine user, particularly in really innocuous social settings like weddings, family gatherings, because I have social phobia, which is a form of anxiety. I have all the coexisting conditions. I'm bipolar, binge eating, social phobia, but that's largely because we have a league table in our house of who's got the most diagnoses. And I'm currently second. And my sister pretended to have a heart attack. This is not a joke. About 2 months ago, because she wanted second place. And she texted us all saying, I've had a heart attack. And of course, we all panicked. And it turns out, no, she hadn't. She just had a slightly raised heart rate. So I'm second in the table, but mum's 90, so give it time. And those coexisting conditions obviously impact the issues that we've got. Now, for years, when I was a heavy cocaine user, I thought it was just a party thing. I thought it was, you know, just a substance use disorder. But I now realize I was self-medicating, particularly for those situations where I would be exposed to social phobia. Now, people think social phobia is just fear of being in groups. It's not. It's actually fear of being in a social situation where you can be judged, where people will make a judgment of you. And at a wedding, when there's 9 strangers sat next to me on a table, oh my God, that is hell. But I knew that if I took a substance that just quietened all that down, I could just sit and listen, which I couldn't do normally. And when I had my diagnostic assessment, I was very honest, and my psychiatrist said, do you use any substances? And I said, yeah, largely cannabis and cocaine. And my psychiatrist said, well, how do you feel when you take cocaine? And I said, well, just calm, I can just sit and listen. And they said, the stimulants will work for you. And that was the first indication of, oh, maybe I've been using this substance for a different reason than the one I thought I was using it for, to just make myself able to sit and listen in peace without all of that internal noise. We're getting to the last few slides now. It's important to talk about this because it's a controversial area, and particularly because during this month, you will see lots of posts on social media. You'll probably see articles written in newspapers and magazines. Actually, no one reads newspapers, do they, James? Jesus Christ, get into the 21st century. You'll often hear ADHD referred to as a superpower or a strength. Now, if you feel that it is, that's absolutely fine. If that's your lived experience, that the benefits of ADHD have allowed you to do things, that's amazing. Hats off to you. I'm happy for you, but it isn't for all of us. And therefore, the statement ADHD is can be quite challenging. If you see people online talking about how it's a superpower, how the reason they're a successful entrepreneur is because of their ADHD, that's often what we call survivor bias. That's somebody who's become successful and has ADHD and links the two together. So the damage of saying it is a superpower is twofold. Firstly, it actually holds all of us back, because at the minute we're trying to fight to have fair access to support through the healthcare system. And if it's a mixed message and some people are saying, well, it's a superpower, why would anyone help us? Why would you get support at work if your line manager and colleagues thought, well, it's a superpower, you know, you don't need help because you've got all these incredible abilities? But more importantly, if you're somebody like many of us who are struggling in one or more areas of life, and you're told it's a superpower, all you've got to do is unlock your ADHD superpower. If you've not unlocked your superpower yet, it can leave us thinking, well, I'm not even doing ADHD right because I haven't found my superpower or strength yet. Now, it's important to state we all have strengths. Everybody has individual strengths. But in society, we tend to value the strengths that are related to doing jobs and doing work because we've fetishized hyperproductivity. We've fetishized this idea of doing loads of work. It's really important. Whereas actually, is it fundamentally? Yes, if it pays the bills. But the strengths of ADHD are probably not what people think they are. And fundamentally, there is no evidence at all for biologically derived strengths that we all have. And if there was, looking at how kind of science works, there's two possibilities. If the superpower argument was true, either, and we'll pick an example. So the two most commonly talked about strengths are creativity and entrepreneurship. If we take creativity as an example, if we are more creative, there's two possibilities. Either everybody with ADHD is more creative than everybody without ADHD, which clearly isn't true. Or on average, we're more creative with ADHD than people without. And if it's the latter, that means there'll be some people with ADHD at the left-hand side of the curve, if you see, that will be less creative than some people without ADHD. So it's not an equally spread strength. Creativity. Some of us absolutely are creative thinkers or creative in general, but we're not all as a group. It's the same for entrepreneurship. I did a podcast recording with some woman, God knows who she was, but during this recording, she says statistics show that we are 500 times more likely to be an entrepreneur. That's not true. And that 29% of all entrepreneurs have ADHD. Also not true. But these kind of poorly researched statistics are out there, and you will see them during ADHD Awareness Month. Now, the evidence suggests that on average, as a population, we probably are more entrepreneurial, but if you dig into that evidence, it's usually those of us with impulsive symptoms, and it's usually later in life. And from my experience, and certainly from the people that I know, it's often because you realize I can't work for anyone else. I need to be able to work on things that are aligned to my goals and values and doing activities that I find rewarding. But some of the strengths that we do have are more likely learned strengths. So we learn to think differently. We learn coping strategies to work with or work around our ADHD to allow us to get through daily life. And that can lead to developing strengths. Like I say, we're not all bad at organization. And we don't all make careless mistakes, which is another criticism of the diagnostic test. Because if you've developed lots of coping strategies, and fellas, we're not as good as this as women are. Women generally develop coping strategies better. If you look at those questions, such as make careless mistakes or lack attention to detail, if you check every email 3 times and use spell checking software, then you probably won't make careless mistakes in emails. So if you look at that question, you might think, no, that's rarely I make mistakes. So when you think about those questions, it's always best to think, what if I didn't have those coping mechanisms? Would I make lots of careless mistakes? But the nuance of the test doesn't take that into account. And we'll often just think, no, I don't. Whereas the real answer in the unmasked us might be, well, yes, I do. So the strengths that we often have, and if anyone listens to the podcast, the balloon-headed imbecile, I set it up with Alex, he likes to call it the Batman Superman kind of narrative. Superman was technically born with strengths, or if you're a comic book fan, developed them when he got close to our son. Whereas Batman was born with trauma, but also some privilege, and developed and learned and trained to have strengths. And that's often when we have strengths with ADHD, how we've developed them, by learning to cope with life and learning to cope with things in different ways. But fundamentally, in the right environment, with the right support, we can all flourish. But for many of us, we're not in the right environment. And we certainly, for many of us, don't have the right support. I don't know what it is about this year, but as an ADHD, actually, it could be that I'm a shit coach. as an ADHD coach, I've never seen so many people either off on long-term sickness absence, who've put a grievance in, who are going to tribunal, who've just left their job, who are considering leaving their job because of that lack of support. Now, ADHD is a protected disability under the 2010 Equalities Act. And what that means is if you disclose it to your employer, they have a legal obligation to make reasonable adjustments and to not victimize, bully, or harass you based on your ADHD. But it still happens all the time, unfortunately. And therefore, even with that protection, many people who are in a job that, particularly if you don't find it rewarding, might struggle with productivity, might struggle with finishing things on time, or more commonly, might have a zero work-life balance because we feel that we have to do more to make sure we're competing with other people because our internal dialogue is often negative. We think, we think we've got imposter syndrome. We think people think, well, I'm not good at this job. Even if we have wonderful annual appraisals that say you're hitting all your targets and you're brilliant, we can still think I've got to work harder because I've got to somehow be as good as everybody else. In the right environment, we can absolutely flourish with the right support to help you with the things that you find challenging and to help you identify the reason you're doing the tasks that you're doing. What's the goal? Who's it for example? In the right environment, we can flourish, but it's sometimes difficult to find that environment. How does this all fit in to the world? Because we've got a society that doesn't understand or accept ADHD. We've got a healthcare system that's fundamentally broken and includes healthcare professionals who don't think ADHD is real. We've got an education system, again, which is broken. One of the worst things that happened for ADHD was a national curriculum saying to children, you have to study these subjects, and not allowing children, as they do in Scandinavia, to learn how to socialize and play before they start to learn information, and not allowing, apart from in some very good schools with very good special educational needs support, not allowing neurodivergent children to follow the things that interest them can be really damaging. So the institutions that are meant to support us don't support us, and that means we often mask, which I mentioned earlier. We often try and fit in and look like people that don't have ADHD, sitting on our hands when we need to fidget, biting our tongue if we want to interrupt, for example. And that comes at a cost, masking. When I first met Sam, and again, this is a good example of how we're all different, I can't sunbathe at all. I timed myself the last time I did, and it was 3 minutes and 47 seconds. And I just had to get up because it was torture. Now, my wife can sunbathe for 8 hours. And when I first met her and we went on holiday and we went to the beach, I obviously thought, what am I going to do? So I lay there for 8 hours in absolute terror, thinking, don't look weird, don't look weird, don't look weird, just lie here because everyone else is sunbathing, whereas my brain was screaming, get up, do something, etc. So we all mask in some situations with some people, but we shouldn't have to. Why should we have to hide our true selves? Why should we have to, at the expense of our mental and physical health, try and fit in, try and appear like somebody else? We are square pegs. And I only include this because I like to say the word pegging. We're square pegs in a society full of round holes. And what masking is trying to cram a square peg into a round hole to make us look like everybody else. Whereas what we need in reality is for society to make more square holes, to appreciate what we have, the strengths and skills that we've got to support the deficits we've got, so we can have happy and fulfilling lives, which I think we deserve, don't we? Okay, that's it. This slide is useful if you want some resources, for example. So when I got diagnosed, I impulsively set up a charity and then just left it to my wife to run. We started a podcast, which is awful. And then I set up my own company. The charity website has a lot of useful resources on there around access to diagnosis. So, for example, for any of you that aren't aware of Right to Choose, there are a number of private providers that have NHS contracts that if you're seeking an assessment, you have the right to say to your GP, please refer me to that clinic there. And some of the clinics, like Dr. J and Partners, the waiting time is 6 months, as opposed to in some areas 7 years. So you have the right to ask for that referral. Often GP practices might still refer you to the local services, and often the most useful person to speak to isn't the GP, it's the medical secretary, and to show them the letters that a lot of these organisations have, which will say this is the process. You just make a referral to us. It's your right enshrined in the NHS Constitution, if you're based in England at least. So those are some resources. That's the end of the talk. Thank you very much. We'll do a Q&A if you've got any questions.